For the queen, the rook is the second most powerful piece. It can move up, down, and to the sides as far as it wants, but the rook can only move in straight lines. Like the other pieces we've looked at so far, the rook also can't jump over any other piece. Let's take a look at some rook moves. In this position, the rook could move straight up, it could slide to the corner, it could move all the way down the board, now it could swing to the other side, or it could make some shorter moves, like here and here. Now that you've learned how the rook moves, it's your turn to practice moving the rook. The bishop is one of the most interesting pieces in chess because it can move as far as it wants, but only on diagonals. The bishop, just like the other pieces that we've met so far, cannot jump over other pieces. This means that the bishop has to stay on the same colored square it starts the game on for the entire game. In chess, you get two bishops. This bishop is called the light-squared bishop because it can only travel on the light squares. Meet the other bishop that you have in the game, the dark-squared bishop. It moves exactly like the light-squared bishop, but only on the dark-squared diagonals. Now that you've met both bishops, let's take a look at how they move. With just one move, the dark-squared bishop can enter the longest dark-squared diagonal on the board. Let's do the same with the light-squared bishop. Now, notice no matter how many bishop moves we make, the bishops never cross paths. They never block each other. And the reason why is because they're on opposite colored squares, so they never interfere with each other. They make a good team. Now that you've learned how the bishops move, it's your turn to practice moving the bishops. The knight is perhaps the most fun piece in chess. It is the only piece in chess that does not move in some sort of straight line. It moves in a strange L shape. The other interesting thing about the knight is it's the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces, like this. It takes a little practice to understand exactly how the knight moves. It goes 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square to the side, like this. Highlighted are all the possible squares the knight can move to on the next turn. Notice it always moves in the same pattern. 2 to the side and over 1, like this, or like this, up 2 and over 1, or down 2 and over 1. And notice that the knight moves from a light square to a dark square, and then on the next turn it moves from a dark square to a light square. The knight always switches colors with each turn it makes. Now that you've learned how the knight moves, it's your turn to practice moving this fun and tricky piece. The pawn sounds like it is the humblest of chess pieces, but it is really one of the most powerful. When working together, pawns are the soul of chess. Pawns have a few strange rules, so make sure to pay attention. Pawns can only move straight forward, and they can only move one square at a time. However, if it is their first move of the game, they can choose to move 2 squares forward if there is nobody blocking them, as pawns cannot jump over other pieces. Remember, the pawn can choose to advance 1 or 2 squares only on the first move. On all other moves, the pawn advances 1 square. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that cannot move backwards. One other thing that makes them strange is that while they can only move straight forward, pawns can only capture diagonally, and they can only capture 1 square away diagonally even if it is their first turn. We will explain capturing in one of the next lessons. Let's see some pawn moves. In this position, since this pawn has yet to move in the game, white decides to move it 2 squares forward. Black, on the other hand, only advances this pawn 1 square. Remember, even though you can move your pawn 2 squares on its first move, you're not forced to do so. White now advances the pawn forward, and now both pawns are blocked and cannot move. In this position, how many white pawns can move? If you said 1, you're correct. Notice that this pawn is blocked by the black pawn directly in front of it. Remember, pawns cannot move backwards. White now has the option to move this pawn up 1 square. Notice this pawn cannot move 2 squares forward because the black pawn blocks it. Now it's your turn to practice using the pawns. Remember, your pawns are the only pieces that cannot move backwards, so what happens when they reach the other side of the board? They get a promotion. You must trade your pawn for another piece. It can be a knight, a bishop, a rook, or the powerful queen. It cannot stay a pawn, and it cannot become a king. Also, it does not have to be one of the pieces already captured in the game. Every pawn has the potential to be promoted into a queen. You could trade it for another queen and have 2 queens on the board, which is incredibly powerful. Now, let's practice promoting some pawns. Now that you know how the chess pieces move, it's time to set up the game. Before you put the pieces on, make sure you turn the chessboard so that there's a light square in the bottom right corner. You can remember this as white on the right. The easiest way to start placing the pieces is to place all of the pawns on the second rank for each side. In chess, rank is the word for row. Let's put all of the white pawns on one side of the board and all of the black pawns on the other side. Now let's put the rooks out in the corners. Let's follow that up by putting the knights next to the rooks. We'll soon learn that the knights are placed on the B and G files. In chess, file is the word for column. To continue, let's put the bishops next to the knights. And now we're left with the king and the queen. Does it matter where they go? Yes, it does. The queen always goes on the matching square. The white queen goes on the light square, and the black queen goes on the dark square. Notice they should be lined up together. Finally, put the kings on the last empty squares. Now you're ready to play. In chess, each side takes only one turn at a time, and by tradition, white always moves first. Now that the board is set up, it's your turn to practice making moves for both sides. In order to get better at chess, you will need to learn notation, which is often referred to as the language of chess. Every square on the chessboard has a name, which is actually just its coordinates. As we mentioned before, each column is called a file, and each row is called a rank. Every file in chess is given a letter, starting with the letter A on the left side of the board and going all the way to the letter H on the right. Every rank is given a number, starting with 1 on the white side of the board and going up to the number 8 on the black side of the board. Each square is named by its coordinate pair. Let's meet some of the squares. This square in the lower left-hand corner is known as A1. Notice we identify it with the letter first and the number second. Let's take a look and see where the E file meets with the fourth rank. Notice the arrows point at E4, so this square is known as E4. Let's draw a diagonal starting from A1 and go all the way up the board. Notice we land on the H8 square, and in between these squares we see B2, C3, D4, E5, F6, and G7. Together, this is known as the A1 to H8 diagonal, because the diagonal begins on A1 and ends on H8. Now that you've learned how to label each square on the chessboard, it's time to learn the notation of actual chess moves. Each piece has its own letter for chess notation. In this example, the king's letter is a capital K. With white to move, let's say the king is going to move to the E2 square. The way we describe that move is by saying the piece's letter first, which is capital K, then the square it moves to, E2. Remember, a piece always begins with a capital letter, and the square is always lowercase. So after the move, king E2, putting it all together, we say K, E2. Let's say black wants to play king to D7. In this case, it's the same idea. Capital K, lowercase D7. So piece, then square. K, D7. We will use the same idea for all the other pieces. The rook is a capital R, the queen, a capital Q, the bishop, a capital B. The knight, however, is a little bit different. Since the capital K is already used for the king, we use a capital N for the knight. For example, N E6. Finally, you may think that pawns are a capital P. In this case, pawns are only written as the square that they move to. For example, after the move E4, the notation is simply the square the pawn moved to, E4. Now that you've learned the language of chess, it's your turn to practice using chess notation. In order to get